What can we learn from Ponzi schemes and multi-level marketing schemes that will help us understand our system better? Because I think we can learn some things about how real, true data can actually lie to us. I think we can learn things about how the system-level incentives can play a role in information distortion. I think we can learn things about the way that theory is sometimes more in touch with reality than data is. And I think if we look at the question, why might the legal version of this, the multi-level marketing scheme, actually be worse than the illegal version, the official Ponzi scheme? That's going to help us understand some of the structure of our system. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to go through and just explain how each of these works and pull out some of these things we might want to notice with an eye toward understanding our bigger system better. Let's start with our official Ponzi scheme. And the guy who runs this, we'll call him Hannibal. He starts with $10,000 of his own money. Or maybe he convinces a bank to lend him $10,000. Maybe he's that charismatic. Either way, he goes out and he recruits 5 initial investors to be sort of the first layer of the pyramid. And they each invest $1,000 of their own money. And at the end of 1 year, he gives them each $2,000 back. So that's a 100% rate of return for these investors. And of course, they're going to go out and brag to everybody because nobody can help bragging when they have made such a wise investment decision. Now, I want to point out at this point that the 100% rate of return, this is real data. This is real money. They actually got the $2,000 from their initial $1,000. There's nothing fake about what they are reporting to their friends when they brag. And all of this bragging does its job so that each of these 5 investors is able to recruit 6 new members of this Ponzi scheme who each invest $1,000 of their money. And this is going to make up the second layer down of the pyramid. And the first layer will reinvest. So Hannibal has $45,000 that he got from his own initial investment and from everybody who's invested so far. There's 35 people to pay out after another year. And so he can give them a 29% return on their money. That still very much beats the market. But we noticed that the return went way down. So we're like, wait a second, this is going to run out of steam at the next layer. However, that's not necessarily the case. Because most people who are investing their money are not going to require that money back after a year. Most of them are saving for retirement or saving for some time in the future. And so Hannibal doesn't actually have to pay out everyone the money that they put in plus a little interest. He just has to project forward like 20 years down the road when they retire and tell them, when you retire, if things go the way they've been going, this is how much you'll get. And now that we're talking about projections, we need to bring up the notion of theory versus data. Because a lot of times people have a sense that data is real world stuff, whereas theory is stuff you make up in your mind. And that's not exactly the way to think about it, because data is inherently constructed. It is inherently decontextualized. And what theory is meant to do, theory is a map that's meant to point your attention to the parts of the real world that fill in the gaps of the decontextualized data. And this is all about seeing the parts of reality that are not very visible. So what's not visible? I mean, projections into the future are not visible. The future is completely invisible, and we have to think about it through something, through some maps. And those maps will need to include both theory and data and our own past embodied experience. Those are the 3 components that will help us to think about the future. And another invisible thing that theory will help us to orient toward is people's motivations. People's motivations are always inherently invisible to us, and yet we can't really get by without having some kind of framework for understanding those. And ideally, you start with a theory as a map, you map it onto what's going on, you bump up against realities that don't fit with your map, and you think carefully about that and update your map so that in the future you have a more complex view that has multiple viewpoints about how to view this person's motivation. And theory is designed to orient you toward what to pay attention to build out a better understanding of people's motives, of the way things play out moving forward, all of that. Now, of course, I am a theory channel. This channel really is about game theory, economic theory, systems theory, and evolutionary theory. So I obviously think there's great value in this. And I should say one of the problems with data is that the people with the money and the power to determine what kinds of data gets collected, those people have an outsized power in the system. So in a lot of ways, the theory and the embodied experience, those can act as a counterbalance to that type of power. So why is the Ponzi scheme destined to collapse? And this is where we bring in the theory, where the theory here is going to focus us on the particular nonlinearities of this case. So our x-axis, we're going to have number of years, where each new year is going to bring a new layer of the pyramid. And of course, I'm simplifying a little bit here. The y-axis is going to be number of people investing $1,000. And right now, the number of people investing each new year, that's growing exponentially. But in this particular case, it cannot grow exponentially forever because the number of people in the world is limited by the world's population. And that bar that's sort of the ultimate cap, will be even lower than that because we take it to mean number of people who have $1,000 to invest, number of people who would invest that $1,000. There's going to eventually be some point at which we cannot cross that boundary. And so the shape of this curve, the nonlinearity, will be initially increasing exponentially as it is now. Eventually there will be an inflection point and it will peter off, and we're going to get fewer and fewer new investors every year. Now, thus far in our story, Hannibal is giving people real data, real information, projections that just assume the past will be like the future, which in many scenarios, that's an accurate representation. It's just that in this scenario, actually, if you look deeper by using theory and real world information to sort of balance the data, you realize that cannot be a realistic projection. So the question is, when we have a petering out of the number of new recruits who are coming into the Ponzi scheme, what can Hannibal do? Does he have to start lying at that point? Or can he actually uphold his little fiction with real data? And the answer is actually no, he doesn't need to start lying at that point. He can still uphold this by just saying, okay, wait a second, we had exponential growth. Now it's starting to peter off, but we'll just assume instead of it continuing to peter off, that it will continue to increase linearly. That's in his view at least, a reasonable assumption projecting past experience forward. And he can continue to do this as long as there are new recruits into the system. Well, what if you don't get any new recruits? Can he actually have projections that he backs up in some real way to keep people coming into the scheme? And yeah, of course, he could just say, oh, this year was just a blip. Eventually it'll get back to normal for our business. Don't worry about the data that seems to be really petering off. Now, what will happen eventually with the Ponzi scheme? And eventually people are going to realize, wait a second, there's no new layer to be recruited. We've tapped into everybody willing to invest. And at that point, people might realize, wait a second, the projections moving forward about what I'll get in my retirement, those are kind of based on faulty assumptions. I'm going to take out my money. And when they do that, that realization can spread quickly through a population because people get scared about being left out of the loop with everyone else taking their money out. And can Hannibal pay everybody back? Well, actually, no, because Hannibal has taken a cut for himself along the way. He's spent a lot of money paying out people who took out their money early so that it makes it seem like a legitimate thing. He wants to give them a high return, such that when everybody all of a sudden goes to him asking for their money back, there's not the money to pay them, and everybody loses out. That's how the Ponzi scheme collapses. But in going through this story, we're trying to understand the way information gets distorted. Because we do live in this world where the information environment is highly manipulative, and we're looking to this story to figure out how can that be, why is that? And of course, the data versus theory story is part of it. What lessons can we take from this that will help us understand our system better? And I want to be really clear here that I am not claiming any particular vision of the future. Nobody can predict the future. That's really hard. And in fact, one of the points I'm making is that projections only work well when the past looks like the future. And sometimes there are reasons to doubt that that will be the case. We live in such a time of rapid change that projections will inherently be less useful. And in times like this, a flexibility of mind is going to be required to think clearly. Moreover, if we want clarity of thought, we may need to resist some of the information distortion that exists inside of the system, and having stories like the Ponzi scheme story in our minds is one way of counteracting that information distortion. But of course, this is both a story and also a theory or a model, and it's going to have the same limitations that both stories and models have. There's no one lens for looking at the world that will fully show you what it looks like. You need to look at things from multiple lenses, especially when it comes to invisible realities, like the future and like other people's motives and like other people's character. And you might notice with those three particular invisible realities, they all have a self-fulfilling prophecy nature to them. If you envision something in the future by projecting it in your mind, you actually make it more likely to happen. And if you treat somebody like they have bad motives or like they have good motives, that actually influences the relationship and the way it plays out between you and that person. And having a deeper understanding of finance and the way finance is playing out in the current system, we'll actually have to wrestle with all three of these invisible realities and their self-fulfilling prophecy nature. And that will be true both for understanding our current system and also envisioning a way of bending the system towards something healthier. And in this video, I'm giving you this notion of the triad, the data, the theory, the embodied experience, and how those complement one another to counterbalance the weakness of each of those branches of perception. So hopefully I'll talk about finance more in this respect in future videos. The Ponzi scheme story is just one anecdote, just one model. But in fact, Ponzi schemes are illegal, and the legal version of this is going to be the multi-level marketing scheme. And this will work the same way, but it will be couched underneath this marketing ploy. And I'm actually going to make the case that the legal version here is more pernicious, that it's actually going to do more destructive things to human communities than the Ponzi scheme did. So how does this work? Well, we have an initial person starting the multi-level marketing scheme. We'll call her Ursula. We'll say she starts with $10,000 of her own money, just like Hannibal did. And the way it generally works is that the people who are investors, they invest by buying a whole bunch of the product. And oftentimes they also have to pay a fee to get in on the scheme. But the product might be makeup, or it might be scented candles or cleaning products. And the marketing scheme is generally that these people will tap into their friend networks and they will host parties where they play up the value of this particular product. And if it's makeup, they'll do each other's makeup, and then at the end of the party, you of course buy a bunch of makeup from the investor. So they're not just an investor. Usually they're an investor, they're a customer, and they are a salesperson. Where oftentimes the person likes the product, maybe they would use the makeup anyway. So part of the way you sell them on this is you would say, you're going to buy the makeup anyway, might as well make some money by being a salesperson and an investor at the same time. And of course, the real ploy here is for everyone to recruit new investors into the scheme such that there's new layers of women. Oftentimes it's women. Oftentimes these actually target stay-at-home moms who feel guilty for not contributing financially to their families. And the scheme sort of sells itself as, oh, here's something you as a stay-at-home mom can do on your own, and you can put your hard work ethic to work here, your social networking. You can be a contributing member of your family. And it sort of takes that really good value that people have, and it operates on top of that. Like oftentimes these move through church communities of people who are like, yes, we are hard workers, we contribute to our family's well-being. It operates on the top of good motives. And as I mentioned before, Ursula's real ploy here is to get people to bring in their friends as investors/salespeople/customers, because those are the people that will be sucked dry of their money. And Ursula is going to incentivize this in a variety of ways with bonuses and cars and vacations and higher sales rates, whatever she can do to make sure each investor is pulling in more investors. So what happens here when these women recruit new people into the multi-level marketing scheme? Well, those people pay money and they get some of the product, and that money can go to support a lavish lifestyle for people on higher layers of the pyramid. And moreover, those lavish lifestyles and the payoffs and the vacations and the cars and the celebration of perhaps a few members of the church or the community, or just people that they meet at conferences who did this and are successful, the company is going to play up those lavish lifestyles as ways of incentivizing more people to put more work into the scheme, to sell more, and more importantly, to recruit new members. And of course, recruiting new members, sometimes you actually have to pay this fee. It's an investor role, and it's the same as the investor role with the Ponzi scheme. At this point, I want to stop and ask the question, how can theory help us to counteract the multi-level marketing scheme? And the key here is that theory points us first to the nonlinearities. It focuses us in on asking the question, what is driving the nonlinearity in this situation? In other words, what causes the number of new recruits into the system to diminish at the margin? And when we think of it like that, it becomes pretty clear that the early recruits are going to be able to tap into the social network to pull in the people in their church that are easy to pull into this scheme. And maybe that's because they're financially desperate, or because they would like the makeup anyway, or because they're just the type who is more responsive to this kind of marketing scheme. Whatever the case, the earliest investors are going to be most likely to tap into the easiest to get to people to buy the makeup and people to become new recruits. And then once those people have been tapped into, the job of finding new people to get in on the scheme becomes harder and harder because you've already tapped that out. Let's compare that logic with the linear logic that the multi-level marketing scheme is built upon. So it is built upon the linear notion that the harder you work, the more financial reward you will get. In which case, members of this church can look at that woman who's selling lots of makeup and they can say, actually, she doesn't work that hard. I know her personality. I work harder than her. So by this logic, somebody who works harder is going to get a higher financial return than someone who doesn't work as hard. And with that linear logic on their minds, they may make decisions that are not actually in touch with the most important factor in this scheme. And this is true of a lot of manipulation in our system in general. It's the way the manipulation happens is through a back of the mind perception of some linear relationship that is not really the thing you want to think about to make good decisions. We also have a lot of binary thinking going on. So either it's hard work or it's tapping into the social network. It's not both. That kind of thinking will get people sort of rejecting this other way of thinking by saying, no, I believe in hard work. I believe there's a payoff to hard work. That is my focus, without considering these other factors, many of which may be more wrapped up with how things are likely to play out. And the theory says, wait, both the hard work and the tapping into the social networks, both of those will play a role. But very likely the one that will play the bigger role is the one that involves change and nonlinearity. That's the way theory trains your mind. In which case, why is this worse than the Ponzi scheme? And my number one reason for this is this scheme taps into shame in a way that is way deeper than the Ponzi scheme. So you might imagine this company has gotten people to tap into their real relationships, their social networks, people they love and people they care about. And it's incentivized them to bring them into the scheme, to get them to sign up. And eventually, of course, these investors/salespeople/customers, they realize, wait a second, I invested in all this, I put all this money into this business with the hopes of contributing to my family, of going on the fancy vacation, and yet I've lost so much money in this process trying to keep up. And when they realize that, when they realize it's a scheme, that's shameful, both because they were duped, but also because they have done this to their friends unintentionally. And when people feel shamed, they don't tend to advertise that. They tend to just pretend things are better than they really are. Maybe even keep the hope going a little bit longer that no, if they work just a little harder, they can be like those people a few rungs up on the pyramid scheme. They may persist in this recruiting of new people just to not have to face the shame. So the tapping into shame, I think, is one of the reasons why this is so pernicious. The second reason is that this really does hurt relationships. Whoever got you into a scheme that ends up bleeding money from your family, especially if your family really needs that money, that's going to harm that relationship potentially. And the whole scheme operates on these interpersonal relationships. So it's moving through communities, destroying communities financially, taking advantage of them through this mechanism. Next, this magnifies the information distortion through this shame mechanism. So the fact that you're not getting accurate information about the likelihood of you actually making money, that comes from people who are inside the scheme, who are holding on to a certain type of hope, avoiding the shame, that makes the information passing from person to person be more and more distortive through the incentive structure. And then the last reason this is worse than a Ponzi scheme is because it's tapping into people's really good values that they want to work hard and they want to contribute. Now, what can we learn about our own system from this example? And it's not like there's exact one-to-one matches. It's more that we're looking at these patterns that could exist elsewhere. And by focusing in on them in this story, we're open to the possibility that other systems elsewhere in the structure we live within could exhibit similar properties. So we might start with the notion that the exploitation here is actually quite hidden. And that hiddenness is basically coming from an invisibility cloak that's upheld through shame, through forces that will make people reluctant to share the truth or the reality of their experience, and maybe even reluctant to actually look that reality in the face themselves. Second, there's the notion that this system operates on the top of trusted social networks, because in this world, people will do things and give more where they actually trust. So the system using those social relationships to accomplish its will is something that we could observe as a pattern elsewhere. There's also the notion of using people's good values and orienting them toward their good values, in this case, their value for hard work and contributing to their family. The system could use those values to accomplish its own goals if it structures incentives accordingly. And then finally, the notion that there's this information distortion that comes from hamming up the example of people who are higher on the pyramid pecking order, such that everybody's watching them get fancy vacations and fancy homes and watching their financial success as if that's a realistic possibility for everybody who works hard at other layers in the system. So that's the end of the multi-level marketing story. But I do actually want to mention one other story that has quite a few parallels with this one, which is the pyramid industry story. And I did another video on this, but basically if you look at a lot of industries like Hollywood and academia and publishing and politics, there's so many industries where the incentive to work really hard at the bottom layer of that industry is the hope of eventually reaching one of those roles where it's not about money, it's about influence and creative license and power. It's about these other non-monetary things that people want. And yet the pyramid structure of the industry means they take the examples of people who exist on the top layers of that pyramid industry, and those people tell their stories about how they moved up in a way that is supposed to be inspirational, in a way that motivates people to do grueling work for years and years at the lower levels of the industry, until they finally realize, wait a second, this pyramid thing, it actually creates misperceptions about the likelihood that I would ever reach one of those roles of creative license. And once again, there's this information distortion element of what's happening. So hopefully the properties of Ponzi schemes and multi-level marketing schemes can help you to perceive possibilities about the structure of our system that might be invisible if you didn't have these stories in your head.